DEADRIA Farmer-PAELLMANN is the founding director of the Restitution Study Group. She recently appeared on NPR Throughline, a segment called The Kingdom Behind Glass. She was joined by Ore Oginbiyi, African correspondent for The Economist, Nwando Achebe, professor of history at Michigan State University, and Dan Hicks, professor of contemporary archaeology at the University of Oxford, and curator at the Pitt Rivers Museum. Here is some of what you did not hear, perhaps due to editing, time, and production restraints. We call this the unfiltered truth.
Okay, it's a little more than halfway. Okay, so it's halfway. Okay, so it's at half. Sure. First of all, thank you so much for inviting me on this show. I'm honored to have the opportunity to share our perspective on the Benin bronze repatriation issue. My name is DEADRIA FARMER-PAELLMANN. I'm executive director of the Restitution Study Group, which is a nonprofit organization founded in 2000. And we fight for reparatory justice, for reparations for descendants of enslaved Africans globally. At this stage, we focus primarily on descendants of enslaved Africans who were trafficked in the transatlantic slave trade, the antebellum slave trade. Really got engaged in the reparations movement just before going to law school. In fact, I was inspired to go to law school in 1994 after working on an African burial ground where first generation Africans were found in a New York City burial ground. They had been enslaved and died and were buried just outside the wall of Wall Street. And so I was inspired to find a case for reparations because these folks were really the first stock on Wall Street. Yeah, the trading of Africans, that was one of the things that I learned. And so my campaign, the Restitution Study Group's work, began exposing corporate complicity in slavery. And so many major corporations were targeted. We made requests for them to pay reparations. And some of them made reparations down payments. Some of them had to be sued. And so we pursued them in litigation. And while we didn't win in court, they say in the halls of justice, justice is in the halls. And so small payments were made outside of that context. And we're still fighting at this point to get payments. But quite a number of companies in educational institutions have made a decision to pay and create endowments. For example, one of our first targets was Aetna Incorporated. They used to write slave policies on the lives of enslaved Africans with the slave owners as the beneficiaries. So a person who might have second thoughts about investing in a very expensive human would be reassured by Aetna that, if you make the investment, go ahead. If they die, you will be able to get some of your money back for that person. And so slave policies were written. New York Life Insurance Company is another company that wrote these policies that we approached on the issue. They were called the Nautilus Company. At first, 100 policies, 1/3 of them were slave policies, and the first policy they ever paid was on the life of an enslaved person. So many of our financial institutions around have their roots in slavery. JP Morgan Chase, Bank of America, Citibank. They're just a large list of companies, and we filed the landmark cases against them, demanding that they pay restitution to share the wealth that they acquired, supporting slavery, financing the transatlantic slave trade, and the plantation owners to build their wealth from uncompensated laborers. Well, the conversation was, we were planting the seeds that really legitimized the movement. At that time, there was a lot of uncertainty about who it was that was making the demand. There were a lot of very militant, progressive organizations, and this demand helped to focus, and by the way, the demand was mostly focused on the government. But this demand that we came forward with helped folks to understand that there are still existing entities that profited from the slave trade, rather than, Southern planters who have long died off. You had multi-billion-dollar corporations that were still alive and that built their wealth. And so that legitimized the movement. And let me just distinguish between some of what you hear today and what our demand was and still is. There's a difference between slavery reparations and Black reparations. Today, you're hearing a lot of calls for Black reparations. And while we support civil rights claims for race discrimination and things of that nature, the demand for slavery reparations is different because we are dealing with slavery where folks were not ever compensated for their labor. Their descendants are standing in their place, making the demand, not just as the descendants, but as people who are injured. That is, we suffer from the injury of ethnocide. We have been dispossessed from our African homelands and the resources, the culture. And so we are victims of the transatlantic slave trade as well. Ethnocide is what we suffer from. And so our claim for slavery reparations and the vestiges of slavery is slightly different from what you hear today. Black reparations includes some slavery reparations, but really folks who like Ta-Nehisi Coates and a lot of others are making demands for reparations for any Black person because most Black people suffer from race discrimination today. And so they're including those demands as well. Jim Crow, that. But ours deals specifically, it's specifically tied to the enslavement of our ancestors. Right, well, in law school, it was my last paper in law school. And just so you know, my research around the corporate complicity was one of my papers for law school as well. So, I didn't waste a minute in law school. I got to work on my life's work. But yeah, I finished my studies at Cardozo Law School, and I took a class on cultural heritage. And my task was to make a claim for the Benin bronzes being repatriated. And through that research, I discovered that the bronzes were made with manillas, a metal slave trade currency. It looks like a little bracelet. These manillas were made of copper and some other metal alloys, but they were melted and they were recast into the bronzes. The Benin Kingdom required that the Portuguese slave traders pay for human captives with these manillas. And roughly, while at the beginning of their trading, you could buy an enslaved captive for 7 manillas, probably towards the end, a male would cost 57 manillas, a female would cost 50, okay? And so this was 1999 when I took the class. And at that time, the most that I could do is know that these manillas were slave trade relics, and that the bronzes were made with them. So I understood that the Benin Kingdom played a significant role in enslaving us, and those bronzes were what we call blood metal, is the bottom line. Mm-hmm. Yes. The manillas were melted, and then they were refabricated into the bronzes. And so the bronzes, it's really important to understand what are the Benin bronzes, and maybe you've covered that already. But the Benin bronzes, at the time, what I understood was that they were about 5,000 or more iconic relics. Now, what we call Benin bronzes today are a mixture of, they could be ivory, leather, wood, or brass. But specifically, we are concerned about the brass bronzes because they are the ones that are made with these manillas. And the manillas were the currency of the slave trade from the 16th to the 19th century. Well, the Benin Kingdom was an empire. It was probably one of the most powerful kingdoms that we know of in Africa. And certainly they grew wealthy off trading various types of products with European traders, not just enslaved Africans, but they sold lots of products. They sold ivory, fabrics, peppers, many different types of things. But when you look at the slave trade records, what you see is the most expensive of products that they sold was human. So they required that the Portuguese pay in manillas at a time when the northern route had shut down for receipt of the metal. And what they did with the metal was they recorded their history. They also, for example, they recorded their history on plaques and sculptures, which are referred to as overheads. And many people have seen these overheads or Queen Mother heads, very similar to the overheads. But the history of the Benin Kingdom is typically recorded. Also included are basically what they would consider the immortalization of their ancestors. That is, the sculptures represented deceased ancestors. And so, sadly, in the Benin Kingdom, based on the records that we've seen, when an Oba died or a Queen Mother died, in addition to burying alive all of the servants, these overheads would be created. And these overheads would sit on altars, and during special occasions or requests, a need for war power or anything that might help the kingdom function in a successful way, there might be sacrifices, human sacrifices, on the altars where these overheads and other brass artifacts were placed. Yeah, well, they traded humans for guns, even at a time when it was illegal for Europeans to give guns to Africans. Many of the traders would give them guns to encourage the pillaging of villages. So, in other words, the Benin Kingdom would use the guns to raid villages, to steal people and sell them. Well, first of all, the Benin Kingdom is in Nigeria, and what we do know is that they controlled a large part of the waterfront of the place called Nigeria today, roughly from Lagos to an area called Focados, or near the Wari River. Okay, so this was a very broad region controlled by the Benin Kingdom. No one could get in and out. And if you've seen the Warrior King movie, you have a general idea of how kingdoms can control a waterfront. So 3.5 million, we have recorded 3.5 million people being stolen roughly from this region. Okay, how many of those people the Benin Kingdom is responsible for enslaving is not certain, because not everything is documented. Okay, what we do have documents for in the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database is 103,000 people. And we were very conservative with the research because there are some waterfront regions that the language is, the names are not known. So the research is still ongoing. So 103,000 conservative, but at least we have some documentation. Most of those people went to Jamaica. Some of them went to the United States, and some went to Brazil. And we know that the trade started in Brazil in roughly 1503, ended in Brazil in 1888. So we know there should be a lot more Brazilians, but they're not recorded. So we don't have all the documentation, but we do have 103,000 documents. Sure, and bottom line is, that's out of a total of 12.5 million people that we have records for. Okay, so it's a large part of the population of enslaved Africans removed. In fact, one of the 23andMe, a DNA company, has recorded that something like 23% of African Americans who are descended from enslaved people are coming from Nigeria, right? The place we call Nigeria today. Okay, so note that Nigeria did not exist as a nation at that time. Okay, but from that region we call Nigeria, 93% of us are coming from. And within the Caribbean, about 82% of them are coming from Nigeria. So a large part of descendants of enslaved people are of Nigerian ancestry. Right, well, first of all, let me just say that from the time I did my research in 1999 until 2022, I began studying the bronzes, visiting every museum that I could possibly visit in the world. and studying their bronzes. I have a daughter, she's 24 now, but she was visiting museums starting at about 4 months old, studying bronzes. And we even have drawings from her toddler stages. She's actually quite an artist. She's an artist, drawing bronzes. So the Benin bronzes have been a part of our lives for 2 decades. And so when in 2022, I saw an article in the New York Times that the Smithsonian would be returning the bronzes, I was quite shocked. And when I say returning, they had a plan to repatriate 39 Benin bronzes. They passed a rule in secrecy without the public having an opportunity to voice their opinions about the repatriation, but they made a rule that allowed for them to give Benin bronzes away to the heirs of the slave traders in Nigeria, the people who actually enslaved us. And so it was almost like a rewarding of the descendants of the slave traders for the enslavement of us. Okay? Well, their justification was that they were looted, that they were stolen artifacts. They had been taken by colonizers. And the reality is that the British did take the bronzes, but the part of the story that the Smithsonian didn't tell, and pretty much almost none of the museums in the world tell the story, is that the taking was in response to a massacre of unarmed Navy officers and African porters. About 250 African porters and about 12 British Navy officers were going to meet with the Oba of Benin in 1897, because the Oba had violated a treaty. This was a palm oil treaty that included some requirements that they stop human sacrifices, right, and stop the transatlantic enslavement of people. The Oba had not adhered to these rules or these parts of the treaty, and basically he felt that he never really agreed to these things. He was forced into the treaty. In any case, the soldiers, and the Navy officers and the porters were approaching the Benin Palace, and they were massacred. They were unarmed, and they were massacred. And in response to that, the British came and destroyed the palace, and they took the bronzes to pay for the expedition or the war. It was essentially a war. And according to the laws of war, taking the relics was absolutely reasonable. It was permitted. There was no law that prevented them from, or it prevented them or prohibited them from the taking. Not at that time. In any case, so that's a part of the story that's not told, and it's one of the reasons we felt strongly that the Smithsonian needed to, number one, recognize that the proper beneficiaries for these relics should be us, the descendants of enslaved Africans, but also that the narrative needed to be completed. The slave trade origin should be told, and the proper order of events around the punitive expedition needed to be told. Because normally, all you hear is that the British came and they stole the bronzes. They never talk about the massacre of over 250 people, unarmed people, and we feel that part of the story should be told. Well, I'm not a practicing attorney. I'm more of a legal strategist. So I did have lawyers when I approached the Smithsonian, but they didn't want our lawyers in the meeting, and the director of the museum, this was the Museum of African Art, acted as if she'd never heard of a manila. At least she behaved as though she'd never heard of a manila. She denied any knowledge of a manila and insisted that no bronze at the Smithsonian had anything to do with slavery. And her archivist agreed with her. So, I sent them documentation, not just, from all of the scholars around bronzes, but from their own website and their own publications that acknowledged that these manilas were used to make the bronzes. And she still insisted, that their bronzes have nothing to do with it. And she went even further than that. she basically, expressed to me that I didn't have a right to have a say in this because I'm not African. Okay, and she was African, part African, part South African, and felt that Africans can manage their own artifacts, and that basically, this is essentially none of my business. But I tried to make it very clear to her that we were enslaved for these bronzes, and we have a right to have a say. Ultimately, the Smithsonian gave us the impression that we would be part of the stewardship of the relics and surprised us with an announcement that they were going to have a ceremony and return the relics to the Benin Kingdom. And so at that point, that announcement came roughly in October, at the end of September, beginning of October, and we had to put together a legal team in about 3 days to respond to this decision. And note, the value of the bronzes is something people don't like to talk about, but one overhead sold not long ago, maybe within the past 4 or 5 years, for about 12 million US dollars. It was about 10 million pounds that the bronze sold for. So just one overhead. So these are very expensive relics. The calculation is that the total collection is worth about 30 billion. And let me just mention this. The Met had an interesting experience. They have one of the largest collections of bronzes in the world. The Met had at one time purchased bronzes, returned them to the Benin Kingdom. They ended up being sold again to somebody. The Met bought them again, returned them to Nigeria again. And at this time, although there's a new database that's supposed to record all the bronzes, these 2 bronzes still do not show up in the database. So for all we know right now, they may be sold again to someone else. And so this is a concern. Where are the bronzes going when they go back to Nigeria? Okay. Well, let me just say this. The Smithsonian was confronted about this possibility, and their PR person at the time, and this is in the New York Times somewhere, she said they can do whatever they want to do with them. Whatever they want, they can do whatever they want. And of course, that still ignores the fact that we were sold into slavery. We have been disenfranchised from our African homelands, the resources, language, culture. We have lost everything. And although we have given them notice, we've even provided them with DNA proof of our connection to the region, it's as if we don't matter. Which is shocking and it's very disappointing. Well, let me just say this. What is the lawsuit? Because a lot of folks don't understand, because we don't just have a lawsuit. We also have claims that went out to about 107 institutions globally, letting them all know that we are making a claim for these bronzes. Okay, so it's not just that lawsuit, but we have made it very clear that we have to have access to these relics. We want them to stay where they are at these institutions so that we can have access to them. Remember, we're still dispersed. No one has asked for us to be repatriated to Africa, the people that were stolen and sold, right? So we don't have access to these relics once they get back to Nigeria. Okay, and then Nigeria has a bunch of other issues that maybe we can talk about a little bit later. But the bottom line is, our demand is that we want access to the relics. But the lawsuit that we filed against Smithsonian was basically it was a restraining order to stop them from transferring the bronzes. It was about $200 million worth of bronzes that they were transferring. There was another $200 million waiting to be transferred because they were engaged in provenance research and only going as far back as the punitive expedition, not going far enough back to determine how the bronzes were made, but just whether or not they were taken from Nigeria during the 1897 punitive expedition. So we were just trying to stop the bronzes so that there would be an opportunity. We were trying to stop the repatriation so that there would be an opportunity to have a discussion about the true provenance of these relics. And the courts chose not to acknowledge us. The conclusion was that I was not a scholar enough to have a legitimate interest in the relics, so that they should stay for me and others who have the kind of aesthetic and academic interest in the bronzes that I might have, but also the cultural interest that I have as a descendant of enslaved Africans. Didn't matter to the courts. And so this was essentially the basis for their rejection of our claim. The other argument that the court rejected was that the Smithsonian had a right to transfer the bronze. Basically, their conclusion is that the Smithsonian has a right to transfer the bronzes. But the law that exists clearly requires that any kind of transfer of the bronzes would have to be within the Smithsonian system. Otherwise, they would have to be paid for, right? Consideration would be required, or a law would have to be passed by Congress allowing the transfer. Now, none of that exists, okay? The other thing is that this administrative procedure law that should have been complied with, and that's one of our arguments. There should have been a public hearing allowing the public its First Amendment right to speak about how we feel about the rule that they created, the rule that they used to transfer the bronzes. They call it an ethical returns policy. Well, you can't just make up a law like that. You can't make up a rule. You have to put it through the Administrative Procedure Act so that the public can voice how they feel about it. And none of this stuff was followed. So you have folks who are on the Board of Regents making decisions based on a woman who says, descendants of enslaved Africans are not Africans. We don't have a say, and transferring $500 million worth of relics to slave trader heirs, and no one gets to voice anything about it. The moral claim is the only claim that I think any of the so-called beneficiaries have to the bronzes, because technically speaking, because of the laws of war, the bronzes were taken legitimately and sold around the world according to law. So the moral claim is that the bronzes for us are the embodiment of our enslaved ancestors. And they are the source of our education about who we are. That, along with the DNA research that we're doing, we're doing a variety of different DNA tests. Mine actually connects me directly to the Benin Kingdom. I have Isan DNA. And by the way, anyone listening to this program that has Isan DNA from their ancestors who were enslaved are literally coming from the Benin Kingdom. Okay. And so I'm one of those people. And we have a global team of people from Brazil, from the Caribbean. We all have Isan DNA. Okay. Well, the Isan people are folks who are Edo. The Benin Kingdom is an Edo people. That the Edo is the ethnic group that they're coming from. Okay, so Isan are Edo people who were part of the Benin Kingdom. The word translates into the people who left, the ones who left. We are the ones who left the Benin Kingdom in the 1400s because there was some rule that our ancestors didn't agree with. But we didn't go very far. The Isan people are located just north of the Benin Kingdom. And a lot of the Benin Kingdom royals are sent there just to keep them out of trouble from being in conflict within the Benin Kingdom. And they're giving kingdoms there in the Isan region. And so I'm Isan. So I am Edo, and I'm actually coming from, and these are royals that are being sent to Isan. So I'm probably a Benin Kingdom royal, and a lot of us are, and that makes perfectly good sense because for 150 years, the Benin Kingdom only enslaved its own women. Okay, they stopped enslaving men, and so a lot of times you'll hear folks say, "Oh, the Benin Kingdom stopped enslaving people." That's a sexist statement because they stopped enslaving men. They only enslaved their women for 150 years. And so I'm probably descended from those women. And there are a lot of other people in the Americas coming from the Benin Kingdom, the women who were sold. Well, the merits of the case were never really addressed. We filed appeals, and the appeals court would never examine the merits that we were trying to get before the court. We did 2 levels of appeal, and then we filed a writ of certiorari with the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court didn't take the case. So that particular claim is not moving. So technically speaking, the Smithsonian is free to continue giving slave trade relics to slave traders, the heirs of slave traders, that is, okay? Which is tragic on a multitude of levels. But that doesn't end our fight. I mean, that's just one fight. We may file another lawsuit. We may just do that. However, we have still 107 claims globally, and we are having tremendous progress with these negotiations. For example, even before we filed the claim with against the Smithsonian, we filed claims in the United Kingdom at the Charities Commission to block transfers that were being made through that system. When a charitable organization like a museum wants to give away some of its assets, they have to make a special request with the Charities Commission. And so we blocked some transfers there. So there are a few institutions that are required to do a hearing with us. And in fact, we've held hearings where we brought in representatives from the Caribbean, a legislator from the United States who's about to introduce a bill to require some of the things that we are demanding in general of stakeholder institutions. Representative from Brazil. And we have been basically duking it out with these institutions to, number one, allow us to be a part of the joint stewardship of the relics. We should be able to determine how these relics are described in museums. We should have interns from the descendants of the slave Africans, training and learning more about these relics. We were even building our own museum at this point. We have begun a franchise called the Benin Kingdom Museum. And so in that context, we're asking the institutions to allow us to scan the bronzes, and we're making replicas. We start a replica class in New York in January. So we are going to start creating our own collection of bronzes that will be at these museums that we create globally. And we are asking for duplicates from these museums, originals, to circulate at these Benin Kingdom museums globally. So these are some of the things that we're asking. Oh, I was just at Jesus College, meeting with a friend of mine who could have said something if he only knew. He had no idea of the slave trade origin, and probably the person you spoke to had no clue either. The best scenario for the bronzes would be for joint stewardship between the descendants of enslaved Africans, along with the Benin Kingdom royals, possibly the National Commission for Museums and Monuments from Nigeria, and the various museums. I think there is a way, we call it a win-win arrangement, that we can all work together and share these relics, because we have a video out. It's called They Belong to All of Us. We believe that the relics belong to all of us, and that there's so much for all of us to learn about humanity, and also the potential for healing and really pulling families back together. Because bottom line is, we are Ado also. And so the Benin Kingdom royals, these are our family members. So the best case scenario is for all of us to work together and share these relics. Yeah, well, one thing I want to just applaud some of the museums that are cooperating with us at this time and are changing the narratives. For example, the Museum Rietberg in Switzerland, we are finalizing new language for their exhibit on the Benin bronzes that does include the slave trade origin of the relics. Also, the Humboldt Museum in Berlin, they have a large exhibit that talks about our of argument, the history, and they've taken the time to really do the research and even include more on the role that Germany played in the transatlantic slave trade and slavery. For example, for 300 years, they are the ones that manufactured the main relics that are in the main manillas that are in these Benin bronzes. You know, there are even some great things coming forward from a major New York museum. And, you know, so I want to applaud those who have come forward and have embraced us and acknowledged our connection. Well, you know, the reparations activist in me says, yeah, why not, right? But what we're trying to do is heal. And there is so much that we can learn from each other. You know, they have stories that we need to know. Part of this whole effort is to ensure that we have access to these relics so that we can learn our history. And they have that information. And so the willingness to sit and work together is about sharing cross-cultural education and just ending what essentially is a war. You know, it hasn't ended yet. It won't end until we sit down together and work together and heal. Research. Oh yeah, so yeah, I'm a New Yorker. I'm a New Yorker, born and raised. You know, yes, exactly. I'm a Brooklyn girl. My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
For more information about DEADRIA Farmer-Paehlmann and the Restitution Study Group, visit www.rsgincorp.org. That's www.rsgincorp.org. Thanks for listening.